thank you for tuning into the Marxist analysis of the Great Depression. A lot of people are interested in this question for very obvious reasons. We appear to be entering into a new Great Depression with the coronavirus crisis, and so people are keen to learn the lessons of what happened in the 1930s, how it occurred and what we can take from that. It's been said that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And it's very clear that the capitalist class has totally failed to learn the lessons of the Great Depression. But us socialists, we're going to learn them here and put them into practice to solve this crisis. Now, as a prelude to the 1929 crash was the Roaring Twenties. Capitalism, global capitalism, had survived the First World War, wave of revolutions, and then a slump in 1920. And they had a decade of boom. But this was, in the main, a speculative boom. It wasn't evenly distributed. In fact, the 1920s gave us some of the highest levels of inequality in human history. That over that decade, the share of income of the top 1% went from approximately 15% to 25%. Those are figures that have only recently returned to mass inequality. That through most of the 50s and 60s, that the top 1% only had about 10% of income. But it raised from 15 to 25 in the 20s, went down to 10, and now it's back up to similar levels. Same thing happened with wealth inequality, that the top 0.1%, they controlled 25% of all wealth. So there's this incredible concentration of wealth at the top and poverty at the bottom. There's a speculative boom. And this speculation was quite extreme. That there was an advance in the stock market, in fictitious capital, in basically gambling on the stock market. And one common practice was known as buying stocks and properties on margin. On margin means that, well, you only had to put down 10% of the value of a property in order to purchase it. You could give over the other 90% upon a certain date. And you didn't have to advance your own money. You could borrow that 10% down payment from a bank, from a financing house, from a speculator. And so you could buy up that stock for the 10% down. And that was fine as long as prices were going up. As long as prices continue to go up, well, that's not a problem. You borrow the money, you buy on margin, prices go up by 20%, you pay back, you get that 20% benefit, you pay back the loan, and then you go and have a party with that money. That's great. That's great as long as all the stocks and properties are going up in value. And in fact, nobody cared about what was the productive base of these stocks that they were buying. They were just buying because people were buying, and buying forces the prices up, and that forces more people to buy. And in a bubble process, this continued in a massive way. They also had certain innovations, shall we say, one of which that Galbraith details in his classic work, The Great Crash, was those of the investment trusts. Now, what is an investment trust? An investment trust is a corporation that doesn't do anything, it doesn't produce anything. It is a corporation to invest in other corporations. And for example, Goldman Sachs, people know them, they started up the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation with a relatively small amount of seed capital. and then people invested in the trading corporation, which then went on and invest in other things. But the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation, in turn, started up Shenandoah, which was another investment trust, which then went on to invest in other investment trusts. In fact, Shenandoah started up Blue Ridge Corporation, another investment trust, and they all inter-invest. Here you have a classic example of what Marx called fictitious capital. And when the stock price of one of these entities goes up, well, then the value of the stock of all the other entities go up. So they all go up, they all go up, they all go up, they all go up. But there's no value being created. There's no actual material wealth. We are so far abstracted from anybody making a real thing. But these were the type of that's the speculative bubble that existed in the 1920s heading up to the 1929 crash. In fact, Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation on the eve of the great crash was worth 222 cents. And after the crash, it was worth less than 2 cents. Total collapse in value. And there was a sell-off everywhere. And actually, there's a great quote from Galbraith. Ted Grant also liked to use this quote, that the stock market is like betting on the horses. Ted Grant was a man who liked to bet on the horses. The stock market is like betting on the horses. But there's an important difference. When you bet on the horses, one horse wins, all the other horses lose. The stock market, it's all the horses win until all the horses lose. And that's what happened at the end of 1929, that this bubble burst. Now, it's wrong to think that this was purely a function of the stock market, purely a function of Dow Jones or anything like that. No, there is a link between the stock market and the real economy. It's not a direct link. It's an abstracted link, but it does exist. Eventually, someone has to make something real to sell to somebody real to encompass real human wealth. And that was actually the trigger for the Great Depression. The stock market crash started in late October 1929, but the global economy and the American economy actually started entering into recession in a reduction in production, reduction in sales and purchases in August of 1929. And this reduction in the real economy is what triggered the stock market crash, which burst the bubble. And then cause becomes effect, and effect becomes cause. They feed back on each other. If it was just an accidental thing, you couldn't conceive of a stock market crash then lasting to a massive collapse in production that lasted 3 years to the end of 1933. If it was just an accidental stock market thing, it would go down and then it would come back. In fact, that has happened in history. There have been stock market crashes. I think 1987 is an example that stock market went down, but then it came back up because the crisis hasn't come to its final conclusions, its final fruition. So this was reflecting something far deeper than this speculation. But this speculation clearly made everything worse. And then once these margin debts, once the prices stopped going up, they started going down, then the creditors started calling in their money. The investors didn't have the money, so they declared bankruptcy. And then those debts, those liabilities ended up being transferred to the banks. And you saw an incredible wave of bank closures, banks going under. Actually, between 1929 and 1933, approximately as 9,000 banks in the United States went under. It's inconceivable to think of now. They went over, and it was a total disaster. The Dow Jones, it collapsed. It started off at a height in 1929 of 381.17, and within a few weeks, it had lost almost half its value and went to 198.60. Huge destruction of stock value. Following year, it recovered a little bit. That instead of a 50% loss, it recovered to a 30% loss from its peaks. But over the process of this 3-year period, in 1932, it bottomed out at 41.22, an 89% loss in value, an utter crisis on the stock market, which then got related to the banks, and you got 9,000 banks went under. I'll explain that a little bit later. But this transition to the real economy, actually there was even some socialists of the time who said, oh, this doesn't affect us. This only a minority of the population is invested in the stock market. That's their problem. This doesn't affect us. We should just laugh at the silly stockbrokers who are losing their money. Very, very mistaken idea, because this very rapidly spread to the real economy. American GDP in 1929 was $105 billion US at the time. 1930 went down to 92 billion. 1931, 77 billion. 1932, 60 billion. 1933 bottomed out at 57 billion. So $105 billion down to $57 billion. Almost half. There's a 45% reduction in GDP over a period of 3 years. Incredible reduction. Unemployment, 1929. I'm going to give year-on-year values. Unemployment starts at 4%, relatively low. Then to 9, then to 16, then to 23, then to 25. 25% unemployment in the United States of America. And this is 15 million people, when population, I think at the time, was about half the present population. So 15 million unemployed and 2 million homeless. 2 million homeless. There was also a collapse in the value of commodities, the price of commodities. There's deflation, not inflation, deflation. And this was related to the bank shutdowns. That in 1930, inflation was minus 6.4%. Next year, minus 9.3%. Following year, minus 11%. They managed to stabilize it in 1933 as plus 1% inflation. So a huge reduction in prices, because there was a huge reduction in demand. People didn't have jobs, people weren't employed, people weren't making money, so they weren't spending, so prices were going down and down and down, and banks were going under. Actually, people probably don't have much of a consciousness of banks going under. How does this happen? Well, banks don't hold all of people give their money to banks to keep it safe, but the banks don't keep all that money in the vault. What they do, they lend it back out again and make a profit, make it interest out of it. They make loans out of it. So they only keep a reserve of 5 or 10% or something like that in the bank vaults. So, but if 10% of people who are keeping their holdings in the bank ask for it back, then the bank will go under. And what's going to happen when you think there's a possibility of the bank going under? Well, you're going to want to get your money out of there, because if you don't, everybody else will get their money out. The bank will go under, and you will lose everything. So that process, that repeated process, also facilitated all of these bank closures. Yeah, so 1930 1,350 went down. 1931, 2,294 banks went down. 1932, 1,700 banks went down. And 1933, when Roosevelt was being sworn into office, there was all these banks were shutting down, and state governors were declaring state bank holidays. They were making it so nobody could take their money out. And Roosevelt came into power. He shut down all of the banks in the entire United States, and moved an emergency bill to supposedly solve this crisis. What did they do? Well, they shut down the 4,000 most precarious banks, but for the other banks, the bigger banks, the more stable banks, that they basically guaranteed all of their holdings. That the state guaranteed, no, we're going to keep this safe. You're going to keep your money. It was a massive, massive bailout, but that stopped the bleeding. That stopped the run on the banks, and helped bottom out the banking crisis, at least. This is this is actually what if you take the right-wing economists, this is how they explain the Great Depression. Milton Friedman and Cole, they say that the result, the Great Depression, was due to a reduction in the money supply. That all these banks going under, that reduced the money supply, that led to deflation, and that's what prolonged the crisis. And what you should do is bail out the banks. Right? They were different from the Keynesianists, who said you should bail out the banks, but you should also give some form of work projects to working class people to solve the unemployment problem. Well, the monetarists, Milton Friedman and Cole, they said, no, don't do that. Don't give any money to the poor. That can't do that. Just give money to the rich. Just bail out the banks and bail out big business. This has been called socialism for the rich and capitalism for the rest of us. This is what was done in 2009. Massive billion dollars or even trillions of dollars of bailouts for the big banks and corporations, and is currently being done in the COVID crisis. They've been bailing out for the rich and giving relatively minor for the poor. In Canada, for example, the amount of value of bailouts of money that is being given to big corporations and banks is some 5 or 10 times the amount that is given to working class people in terms of benefits and various coverage to help people weather this crisis. But that's the approach of the monetarists. But it does beg the question: who pays? Who pays? Do the poor, do the working class pay for it, or do the rich? Do they pay for it? And they're saying, no, the rich get bailed out, the poor get nothing. Now, the question of who pays has incredible revolutionary significance. In fact, pretty much almost every revolution in human history, the question of who pays has played a significant role, whether the rich, the ruling class, pay, or whether the poor, the working masses, they pay. And that is the question of almost every revolution. Now, at the time, the bourgeois weren't monetarists. They didn't bail out people, God no. But they were laissez-faire, hands off. The invisible hand of the market is supposed to solve everything. Well, the laissez-faire approach, well, I guess it is more egalitarian in that it's no money for the rich or the poor. But it did facilitate these bank crises, these bank collapses, which you haven't seen as much in the present crisis because of the bailouts. But this was their philosophy, laissez-faire. Again, you see, this is an example. Capitalism does not work. left to itself, the invisible hand of the market completely fails to solve the crisis. And you need to take a socialist perspective if you are going to solve the crisis. So what did they do? Well, laissez-faire, but not just that. They also believed in protectionism. That in the United States, they passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which hiked tariffs on imports by approximately from 40% to 60%. And the idea was to safeguard domestic production, domestic market at the expense of your foreign competitors. This is an attempt to export unemployment. And I think Donald Trump thinks that he can do something similar, that he thinks that he can be protectionist. And, you know, if you are the only country, if you are the only capitalist class being protectionist and everybody else has free trade, well, there's a certain logic to it. You get to keep your own market and then you get to try to steal some of their markets. But that's not the way it works. That's not the way it works. When one player starts being protectionist, then they all start being protectionist. In Canada, you had the imperial preference policy. There was a conference of all the representatives of the British Empire, the Commonwealth, and they instituted the imperial preference policy, whereas home market first, the empire second, and the rest of the world third. So there was these huge protective trade barriers between country to country to country. This had a disastrous effect upon world trade and production. For example, the United States exports went from $5.2 billion a year to $1.7 billion a year, a total collapse in exports. Canada, in response, they put on 30% tariffs against 30% of American goods. And this resulted in the value of wheat collapsing. Canada was responsible for 40% of global wheat production in the period. And wheat went from $1.43 a bushel to 60 cents a bushel. Total collapse in that market, and a real disaster. And you think about this in the logic of capitalist economics. What does protectionism mean? It means you are buying a less efficiently produced, more expensive commodity produced at home instead of a more efficiently produced, cheaper commodity from abroad. And if you generalize that to the global market, it means the general productivity, general efficiency on average goes down, a reduction in everybody's GDP. So protectionism served to spread the Great Depression and the stock market crash throughout the 1930s. And it was only eradicated after the Second World War. So in summary, what was the results of the 29 to 33 period, the most acute period of crash? Well, in the United States, wages were down by 60%, 15 million unemployed, 30 million on some form of government or charitable support. In Canada, the gross national expenditure was down by 42%. The average income of Canadians in this period was 50% below the poverty line. So the average person was 50% below the poverty line. Unemployment was 30%. And then you also had confounding factors, extenuating circumstances. That the same we're seeing in the COVID crisis. A global crisis was in preparation way before the virus hit. If you go to the pages of Marxist.com and Marxist.ca, you will see that we've been predicting this crisis for a while now and explaining it's a classic capitalist crisis of overproduction. We've been explaining that. And we were saying it's just going to take some spark to set it off. We didn't know that it was going to be a virus. It could have been anything. It happened to be a virus, which would have resulted in a huge crisis, regardless of the general crisis of capitalism. But that accident, that situation, has revealed everything that is weak and decrepit within capitalist society that is already in crisis. A healthy society, a society that produces for need instead of profit, well, we couldn't stop viruses from happening, but you could actually manage it far better. A healthy society could cope with COVID. A decrepit, dying society, we will have all of the disasters that we have present. Well, the same thing happened in a related way in the prairies in Canada, that combined with the Great Depression, you had the accident of a drought. You had a drought which led to, on the prairies, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the total failure of the crop. That they couldn't, people couldn't survive. In fact, in Saskatchewan, there was a 90% reduction in income. And 66% of the Saskatchewan population were on some form of relief. And they didn't just have a drought, they had plagues of grasshoppers. Millions and millions of grasshoppers going around, and basically locusts, going around and eating up any of the vegetation that had survived the drought. So it was biblical proportions of disaster. Again, a healthy society, a scientifically run society, could have coped with this irrigation and applying science to agriculture. But in the middle of the Great Depression, this accident made everything so much worse. And that's the real story of the first phase of the Great Depression.